Some lives are not shaped by a single moment of eruption, but by the way a person continues to live when everything familiar slowly withdraws. Not through victory, but through staying with one's work day after day as the space around it quietly narrows. Tonight's story begins with a simple question. What keeps a person staying when the things that once defined them begin to fade? Ludwig van Beethoven is often remembered as a genius. But genius is only the surface. Beneath it lived a man shaped by discipline, by isolation, and by a working life that stretched far longer than any moment of acclaim. He was a musician who emerged from a world of ritual and patronage, yet gradually wrote music that moved beyond inherited forms. He was heard across Europe, even as he himself slowly lost the ability to hear the world answer back. Some see greatness in Beethoven. Others see only a difficult man, rigid, uncompromising. But if we look long enough, something else appears. A life organized around work, even when the body and circumstances no longer made that work easy. He did not live through grand declarations. He left behind no ideology that needed defending. He simply continued to work, allowing the music to find its own way into the world. If you are listening right now, allow yourself to slow down a little. There is no need to remember every date. No need to follow every detail closely. This story is told so you can listen in a state of rest, letting the sound of the narration blend with the rhythm of your breathing as it softens. If while listening an image or a thought stays with you, you are welcome to leave a comment. And if you would like to continue with journeys like this, you can subscribe to the channel, press like, or share the video as a quiet way of saying that you are still listening. Now, as everything settles into enough calm, let the story begin to drift. This is the bedtime biography of Ludwig van Beethoven. Chapter 1. Beethoven at the end of life. The room and the silence. Night settles over Vienna, not through darkness, but through a gradual quieting. The sound of carriage wheels along the street grows sparse. Late footsteps dissolve into the distance. The city, restless throughout the day, now seems to draw itself inward, making room for a deeper silence. In a small room high above the street, Ludwig van Beethoven sits motionless by the window. He cannot hear the night, but he knows it has arrived. The room is modest. The ceiling is low. The walls carry the stains of many winters. On a heavy wooden table lie loose sheets of paper, ink, and pen, a few manuscripts not yet put in order. There is no piano at the center, as one might imagine in a composer's room. That instrument has been pushed aside like a keepsake that no longer serves its original purpose. Beethoven is past 50. His body is tired and often in pain. His ears no longer function in any reliable way. The last sounds he can still sense are not voices and not music, but vague vibrations rising from within his own head, like echoes from a world that has already closed its doors. He looks out the window. Snow is falling very lightly. Not the white storm of his youth, but small, quiet flakes drifting without intention. He does not hear them touch the ground, but his eyes can still follow their slow descent as if time itself were passing before him moment by moment. There are evenings when the silence in the room becomes so dense it nearly takes on a shape. It fills the space between the table and the window between him and the world outside. Not the gentle silence of rest, but a silence that forces a person to remain with himself, with no exit. Beethoven has grown accustomed to it, at least to some degree. On the table, a pen lies diagonally across the page. The ink has dried at the tip. He is not writing now, not because ideas are absent, but because the body refuses. The air carries the scent of old ink and paper dampened by many winters. A familiar smell, not unpleasant but heavy, as if time itself were settling into this room. When Beethoven places his hand on the wooden table, he pauses for a moment to steady a body that no longer trusts itself. Pain arrives without warning in the abdomen, in the joints in the head. It does not need sound to announce itself. It simply appears, takes its place, and then withdraws. In the final years of life, people often turn toward memory. But Beethoven did not dwell in nostalgia as much as others might imagine. The past for him was not a place to return to. It was more like a locked room filled with sounds he could no longer hear. Instead, he lived within this narrow present. One room, one window, one table, one body slowly running out of strength. Some people still came to visit. Old friends, students, messengers with letters. But these meetings were always brief, not because they wished to leave, but because communication had become heavy. Faces had to strain so lips could be read. Sheets of paper passed from hand to hand. Answers arrived slowly, often out of step with the rhythm of conversation. When the door closed behind them, the room returned to its original state. No noise, no interruption, only Beethoven and a silence that no longer frightened him, but offered no comfort either. He had once been the center of concerts. He had stood before orchestras in light and applause. But those images no longer appeared as living memories. They came from far away, blurred like stories told by others about his own life. In this room, fame carried little weight. It did not bring warmth. It did not soften the pain. And it certainly did not restore sound. Only one thing had not disappeared: the presence of music, even if it could no longer be heard. It existed somewhere else, not in the ears, but in bodily memory, in invisible structures he still managed to hold. Beethoven knew he was nearing the end, not through vague intuition, but through an exhaustion that never lifted. Each passing day felt less like moving forward and more like an effort simply to remain upright. He rose and moved slowly toward the table. His hand rested on the cold wood. The sensation was clear, solid, real. Outside Vienna continued to exist. The city still held music festivals, the sound of voices and laughter. But none of it entered this room through sound anymore. It survived only as a general idea, asking nothing in return. Beethoven returned to the window. Snow was still falling. Time in this moment seemed to have no reason to hurry. Silence did not arrive with death. It had been here already, in this room, in the man standing very still, watching the world pass by without needing to hear it. Chapter 2. Conversation books, when writing replaced the ear. The man standing across from Beethoven hesitates for a few seconds before speaking. Then he falls silent, as if suddenly remembering something important. He bends down, looks for a pen, and pulls a chair closer to the table. Only when the tip of the pen touches the paper does the conversation truly begin. On the wooden table in the familiar room lies a small notebook, its cover worn smooth. The paper inside is uneven. Some pages are thick, others thin. The handwriting comes from many different hands, sometimes careful, sometimes rushed. This is not a diary, nor is it a musical manuscript. It is something else entirely, more practical, more subdued. These are the conversation books. From around 1818, when his hearing had nearly vanished completely, Beethoven had no other choice. To ask, to answer, to object, to explain, he needed paper and pen. The person facing him would write the question. He would read it. Then, he would respond, sometimes aloud, sometimes with a few brief lines depending on his strength. Conversation no longer flowed with a natural rhythm. It was broken into fragments, interrupted, slowed down by each movement of the hand. Not everyone had the patience. Some questions were very simple. Are you well? What would you like to eat? But when they appeared on paper, they became heavier. They required time to arrive and time to leave. Between question and answer, there was always a gap, a space, where silence slipped in like a third person sitting at the table. Some believed that writing would make communication clearer. But for Beethoven, it revealed something else. Solitude. When people speak, they hear their own voice rise and fade away. When they write, the words remain on the page. They do not disappear. They stay there, forcing the reader to face them. Strangely, while communication with the world grew more difficult, his work as a composer did not stop. It became slower, more concentrated. But it did not vanish. Music for Beethoven at this stage no longer needed to be heard in order to exist. It took place somewhere else, in memory of structure, in the sensation of tension and release, in a form of understanding accumulated over a lifetime, strong enough to survive without the ear. Those who came to visit were sometimes surprised. They saw that he still spoke about music, still argued, still revised. But they could not hear what he was hearing, and he could not hear what they were trying to say with their voices. Two worlds existed in parallel, touching only on the surface of the page, then separating again. Vienna continued to live on. Concerts still took place. Salons are still filled with laughter and debate. But Beethoven was no longer a natural part of that rhythm. He stood at the edge, not because he had been excluded, but because he no longer possessed the means to step inside. In the familiar room, the conversation book was set aside, resting next to a musical manuscript. Two kinds of paper. Two purposes. One to connect one person to another. one to connect a person to something beyond themselves. Beethoven understood this distinction clearly, and perhaps it was no accident that the less he heard the world, the more he turned toward music that did not require a direct listener. Writing had replaced the ear in everyday life. But in music, the ear itself was no longer a necessary condition. Chapter 3. Symphony No. 9. Music that does not need to be heard. At first, Beethoven was simply trying to keep the work going within a life that was growing steadily quieter. Not all at once. Not as a declared decision. It came slowly seeping into small habits, into mornings that began without the need to listen for how the city was waking up. Music no longer required the ear to confirm its existence. During these years, Beethoven worked slowly, not because ideas were scarce, but because each one was held for a long time before it was allowed onto the page. He no longer tested by playing, no longer heard mistakes in order to correct them immediately. Everything unfolded inwardly in a place where time moved differently. The manuscript appeared in fragments. Some passages were written and set aside. Others were returned to again and again, each time altered only slightly. There was no one sitting nearby to say whether a melody had sounded yet, no sound to urge the work forward or hold it back. Only structure, rhythm, and a sense of tension and release he had carried within himself for an entire lifetime. Beethoven knew exactly what he was doing. This was not compensation for deafness. It was a different way of working pushed to its furthest limit. When he began the great work of his final years, there was no feeling of culmination or summation as later generations would imagine. There was only a quiet pressure, not the pressure of reputation, but of time as health steadily declined. Each page was weighed carefully. Every section kept or discarded carried consequences. There was no room for excess. When the premiere took place in 1824, Beethoven was present. He stood on the stage close to the orchestra. But the world experienced by the audience did not coincide with his own. They heard music filling the hall. He did not. For Beethoven that evening was not confirmed through sound. It was confirmed through sight, the movements of the orchestra, the physical pulse of the performers' bodies, the focused intensity on their faces, and then the applause. He did not hear the clapping, but he saw the change in the air. He saw people rise to their feet. He saw arms moving faster and faster. Someone had to touch him gently to turn him around to face the hall now glowing with light. This moment is often retold as a tragedy. A genius unable to hear his own work, but for Beethoven, perhaps it was not entirely so. This music had never required his ears in order to exist. It had completed its journey long before in silence. That work, the Ninth Symphony, was not written to compensate for loss. It was written from within a world where sound had been removed from the creative process. And because of that, it carries a different quality. Not intimate in the old sense. Not dependent on the immediate pleasure of hearing. It is broader, slower, and less in need of the presence of its creator. Beethoven stood there, amid light and movement, without being drawn in. He had already been far from this moment. His work was finished. What remained no longer belonged to him. What mattered had happened elsewhere, in the years before, in the quiet room, on pages that made no sound. Beethoven had proven to himself that music does not need to be heard in order to be created. This was a step that could not be reversed, not only for him, but for the history of music itself. From this point on, the composer was no longer required to be a listener. Creation could take place entirely within, separated from a body growing weaker. But the cost of that step was unmistakable. Silence was no longer a temporary working condition. It had become absolute. There were no gaps left for the world to enter. No fragments of sound to hold on to a sense of connection. And to understand how he was able to live within such a condition, one must look back at the path that led him here. Chapter 4. Beethoven's Youth. Bonn and the Sound of Keys in the Night. Bonn in the 1770s was a small, subdued, inward-looking city stretched along the banks of the Rhine. The river was wide and slow, carrying the scent of cold water and damp silt. Each early morning fog settled low over the surface, drifting into the cobbled streets, clinging to the heavy coats of those who passed by. This was not Vienna, a city of music, nor yet Paris, a city of ideas. Bonn belonged to the electorate of Cologne, shaped by the order of court, church, and military life. Church bells rang with regularity, dividing the day into clear segments. People were accustomed to a steady rhythm with little change. Mornings brought the market the smell of freshly baked dark bread, mingling with tanned leather and wood smoke. At midday, guards changed shifts in front of the administrative buildings. In the evening, the lights went out early. After sunset, Bonn grew so quiet that one could hear the river brushing softly against the shore. In a modest house near the center of town, candlelight often burned later than elsewhere. The room was narrow, the ceiling low, the thick walls holding the damp scent of winter and the smell of melting wax. A keyboard instrument stood against the wall, dark wood, keys worn smooth from use. This was not a space for receiving guests. It resembled a workroom more than a home. There a child sat before the instrument, too young to understand why he was required to stay awake after the city had fallen asleep. He knew only that night meant his hands had to rest on the keys. Short fingers, stiff from the cold, pressed down one note at a time. The sound that emerged was dry, sometimes uneven. This was not music meant to be enjoyed, but the sound of practice. His father stood behind him. Johann van Beethoven had once been a singer in the court orchestra, but his reputation was fragile, his finances uncertain. The sharp smell of alcohol on his breath mixed with candle wax and old wood. In late 18th century German society, opportunities for advancement were scarce. A musically gifted child was seen as a possible escape from a confined life. That pressure settled on the boy's shoulders early. That child was named Ludwig van Beethoven. born in 1770, baptized at St. Remigius Church. On paper, there was nothing remarkable. But the long nights at the keyboard were already shaping a rhythm of life, a part separating him from the rest of the city. Outside Bonn maintained its familiar order. Officers in dark coats crossed the square. Craftsmen closed their workshops as night fell. Enlightenment ideas had begun to circulate through Europe's larger cities, but here they appeared only in a few books, in small conversations among intellectuals. Most of life still revolved around duty, discipline, and religious faith. Inside the room, time moved to a different rhythm. It was not measured by church bells, but by the number of repetitions of a musical passage. When the boy played incorrectly, the sound stopped. When he played correctly, the space softened. The gaze behind him grew less tense. These were rare moments of calm. As night deepened, the air in the room settled, carrying the dry sweetness of candle wax, the smell of sweat from long practice. The scent of old wood absorbs sound. These sensations entered the body before thought. They became a habit and then a foundation. In the society of that time, strict discipline toward children was considered normal. Talent was believed to require pressure. No one called it harsh. They called it preparation for life. Music, therefore, was not a natural joy. It was work, duty, the only path that could be seen. The night moved slowly. The city fell silent. Only the sound of the keys remained, sometimes broken, sometimes more continuous. The boy did not think about the future, not about stages or fame, only about finishing the practice so the room could return to quiet. When the candle burned low, the light dropped shadows of moving hands trembling on the wall. The sound stopped. There was no praise, no applause. Only fatigue was settling in alongside a breath that gradually evened out. No one in that house knew that these repeated nights were shaping a complex relationship with sound. Music came to Beethoven not as freedom, but as discipline, not as a choice, but as something unavoidable. Yet within that steady repetition, something else was taking shape. Quietly, slowly, like the Rhine outside, never loud, but never ceasing. Some lives begin within a narrow order, and from there they learn how to widen the world. Chapter 5. A Child Without a Childhood. In the morning, mist from the Rhine still lay low over the rooftops, leaving a thin chill on the stone-paved streets. The city woke to familiar sounds, wooden wheels rolling slowly, voices calling out in the market. Church bells are ringing with steady regularity. Within this rhythm, a child rose from sleep with no space set aside for drifting or delay. In Bonn at the end of the 18th century, childhood was not a concept to be cherished. Children were seen as extensions of the family, of a trade of expectations not yet fulfilled. Adults believed that early discipline would produce a solid future. Music, therefore, was not a play. It was work begun very early. The boy named Ludwig van Beethoven sat at the keyboard while daylight was still weak. Cold fingers, not yet long enough, repeated familiar exercises. There was no sense of beginning, only a continuation of the night before. That small body learned how to work before it learned how to dream. Bonn maintained a court orchestra to serve the rituals of the electorate of Cologne. Rehearsals took place in enclosed rooms with low ceilings where sound bounced back quickly and clearly. Music there demanded precision more than emotion. Beethoven entered that space like a young apprentice, listening, imitating, repeating. He studied keyboard, violin, and viola. He learned by playing again and again. Bach's music was copied by hand onto thin paper. The ink seeped slowly, leaving uneven traces. Each note was a specific demand, not to be forgotten, not to be missed too often. There was no room for spontaneity. In other homes, children played in the streets when the weather allowed. Laughter burst out and quickly dissolved into the damp air. But in Beethoven's house, sound carried a different weight. It was tied to hours, to glances, to the silence that followed. Time did not move freely. It was measured by the number of times a passage was repeated. The 1770s and 1780s were years when Europe began to shift slowly. Enlightenment ideas moved through books and music, speaking of reason, of the individual, of the right to think. But these notions rarely reached the lives of children. For them, the world still operated through command and obedience. His father continued to press forward, not through long explanations, but through constant presence. A gaze fixed on every key, fear of poverty, of failure, of opportunities, slipping away before they could be grasped. In that society, waiting was considered a risk. There were small performances before adults. The light in the room was brighter. The air was heavy with wet coats, polished wood, and the faint perfume of the nobility. Small hands rested on the keys. The sound emerged clearer than expected. Nods appeared. Whispered remarks followed. They pointed toward the future, not the present. For the boy, these performances were not very different from practice. Just more people, more pressure, and a quicker end. When he returned home, the instrument was still there waiting. Time closed in again around the wooden keys. Beethoven had few companions of his own age. Not because he was forbidden, but because time left no open spaces. Rare gaps were filled with new lessons. Music became the primary language of life. Not for communication, but for survival within an order already set. Some evenings he nodded off at the table. The pen fell to the floor, making a small but distinct sound. His body startled awake. Then he sat upright again, continued, not out of enthusiasm, but because it was what was expected. Beethoven's childhood did not end with a single moment. It dissolved gradually through repetition, like an afternoon stretched too long. By the time he realized he was no longer a child, it had already happened. Music at this point was still not freedom. It was discipline obligation, the structure that kept everything from collapsing. But in very small spaces between exercises, short melodic fragments began to appear. Not enough to be called a composition, just enough to reveal a quiet movement within. As afternoon light slanted through the window, dust drifting slowly in the air, the sound of the keys stopped mid-phrase. Outside, the Rhine continued to flow at its own pace. Inside, another rhythm of life had taken shape. From this point on, Beethoven was no longer learning in order to grow up. He was growing up in order to continue learning. Chapter 6. Beethoven's Teacher and the First Open Door. Some moments are not loud. They do not arrive as events. They come as a very slight change in the air. In Bonn in the early 1780s, the city still held its familiar shape. Narrow streets, low houses, a rhythm measured by church bells and the court calendar. Yet in small reading rooms, in quiet conversations behind closed doors, a new current of thought was moving slowly. People spoke of reason, of the human being as an individual with the right to think. Books passed from one hand to another, carrying the smell of old paper and a subtle sense of difference, not hurried, but persistent. It was within this atmosphere that Ludwig van Beethoven met a teacher, not the first to teach him music, but the first to see music as a doorway. Christian Gottlob Neef was the conductor of the Bonn Court Orchestra. He was not a dazzling genius, nor did he carry great renown, but he belonged to the world of Enlightenment thought. He read, he wrote. He believed that art did not exist only to serve ritual, but to expand the human being. When he watched the boy at the keyboard, Neef did not hear precision alone. He heard a possibility that had not yet been named. Lessons began to change, no longer only repetition. Neef placed before Beethoven the music of Bach, pages dense with counterpoint, strict, unforgiving. Music there resembled architecture. Every note had its place. Every deviation exposed the structure beneath. The boy learned by copying, line by line, staff by staff. Ink seeped slowly into the paper. Time seeped in the same way. Bonn was not Leipzig or Vienna. Yet in those small rooms, Bach's music opened onto a far wider world. A world where freedom did not lie in breaking rules, but in understanding them deeply enough to pass through them. Beethoven absorbed this first with his hands before he ever did with words. Neef did not teach only music. He introduced the boy to books, to poetry, to the idea that a person could think independently, rather than merely repeat what was assigned. In a society still shaped by hierarchy, this was a quiet but decisive shift. A child raised in discipline began to glimpse another path, one where the intellect itself could become a key. In 1783, Beethoven appeared for the first time as a composer. Not through a declaration, simply through a few small works put into print. Neef wrote about him in a music journal, calling him a promising young talent. Those lines did not change Bonn, but they changed the boy's position in the world. From an apprentice, he began to be seen as an individual in formation. The atmosphere around Beethoven was different now. The long hours of practice remained. The discipline remained. But between the staves, there was now space for thought. He no longer played only because he had to. He began to ask why a passage stood where it did, why one motion created this feeling rather than another. Outside Europe was shifting slowly. New ideas had not yet erupted, but they were strong enough to loosen old structures. In music, this appeared in the changing role of the artist, no longer only a servant, but increasingly a thinker. Beethoven stood precisely on that threshold, even if he did not yet know it. Neef understood that Bonn would not be wide enough. Vienna was still far away, but the idea of another place had appeared. Not as a vague dream, but as a door that had been pointed out. The boy had not yet stepped through, but he knew it existed. In the afternoons, light slanted through the classroom window. The sound of the keys paused longer between passages, not from fatigue, but because thought intervened. Music began to take on a different depth, less driven, more self-directed. Beethoven was still very young. The life ahead of him had not yet revealed itself. But one thing had changed forever. Music was no longer only a discipline imposed from outside. It had become an inner space opening outward. The first door did not lead far. It led inward. But for someone who had grown up within harsh repetition, that alone was a profound shift. Some teachers do not give us a path. They simply show us that the world is larger than we were ever allowed to see. As the years in Bonn drew to a close, Beethoven did not yet know how far he would go. But what had taken shape here in silence and discipline would remain with him for the rest of his life. Chapter 7. Vienna at the end of the 18th century. A city of music and opportunity. Vienna at the end of the 18th century rarely closed itself with sunset. When the sun went down, another rhythm began. Oil lamps along the streets reflected on wet stone. The sounds of wheels' footsteps and conversation merged into a continuous undercurrent. Here music did not wait for festivals. It was present every evening in salons, in theaters, in rooms, where people gathered to listen and to be heard. When Ludwig van Beethoven arrived in Vienna, he stepped into a world with a completely different pulse. This city did not merely consume music, it lived by it. In Vienna, a melody could open doors, but it could just as easily close them. Talent was welcomed, but only if it knew where to stand. The air of Vienna carried a mixture of scents. Smoke from stoves, damp wool from winter coats, paper ink and polished wood in drawing rooms where pianos stood against the wall. Entering a salon, one did not hear music alone. One heard whispers, restrained laughter, the soft clink of glasses. Music had to find its place among these sounds in order to exist. Beethoven did not come to Vienna as a complete unknown. He carried with him a modest reputation from Bonn and carefully worded introductions. But Vienna had little interest in the past. The city asked only one unspoken question. What can you do here now? The first meetings took place in rooms warm enough for long sitting. The listeners sat close. The distance between performer and audience was so small that one could hear breathing. Beethoven played with intense focus, not excessive in display, not deferential. His music bore the marks of heavy discipline from childhood. Yet within it were passages that revealed a different force difficult to name. Vienna still lived in the shadow of great names. Standards had been set very high. Music was expected to be balanced, clear, and orderly. Those who strayed too far were judged rough or uncultivated. Beethoven sensed this clearly. He did not resist it. At least, not yet. First, he learned how to stand firmly within the order of this city. Life in Vienna was not easy. Rent, tuition, daily expenses. Everything costs more than in Bonn. Beethoven had to rely on patronage. Meals depended on invitations. Performances depended on goodwill. In elegant drawing rooms, courtesy concealed very clear boundaries. Artists were welcomed, but never entirely belonged. By day, Beethoven studied and practiced. In the evenings, he appeared at gatherings. The warm yellow light of oil lamps settled over the faces of listeners. As he played, the room gradually grew quiet, not out of reverence, but curiosity. This music felt familiar, yet strange. It followed the rules, but not obediently. The city around Beethoven moved without pause. Carriages passed. News from Europe's courts reached the cafes. People spoke of politics, of war, of changes on the horizon. Vienna sensed that the old order was no longer as secure as it appeared, even as its surface remained splendid. In this atmosphere, music became a place where people sought stability or a hint of something new. Beethoven absorbed all of it not only with his ears, but through observation. He learned how to read a room, to know when to reveal, when to hold back. This was no longer the small room in Bonn. Every note now carries a consequence. Late at night, returning to his cramped lodging, the city still murmured outside. Beethoven sat again at the keyboard in a space narrower and quieter. Their music was not meant to persuade anyone. It returned closer to breath, closer to the original concentration. But it was no longer the same. The world had opened, and it could not be closed again. Vienna did not offer Beethoven safety. It offered him a long trial. In this city, to survive, one had to adapt while holding on to what could not be traded away. He remained there within a city always in motion, learning how to listen without disappearing, learning how to be present without display. Vienna promised nothing, but it set a silent condition. To stay, one had to preserve one's own shape. And on those late returns when carriage sounds had thinned, when the small room finally grew still, Beethoven sat once more at the keyboard. The music then did not turn outward. It turned inward, as a way of testing amid all the sounds of the city what still remained unmistakably his own. Chapter 8. Beethoven and the Viennese Aristocracy. In Vienna, no one lived by talent alone. Music needed space in which to sound. And that space belonged to the rooms of the aristocracy. They were warm, spacious rooms with high ceilings where oil lamps were placed carefully to give just enough light. Portraits of ancestors lined the walls. Polished wooden floors reflected leather shoes and long coat tails. Music was not meant to shake the room. It was expected to blend into daily life as a sign of order and refinement. Ludwig van Beethoven entered these rooms without a clearly defined position. He was not a servant, but he was not the host either. He was invited, welcomed, and listened to always within limits. His music existed through patronage, and that was never without cost. The Viennese aristocracy loved music. They were willing to pay for it. But they loved music that knew its place, that knew when to stop, that did not disturb a sense of security. For them, music was part of the social order, not a space for questioning it. Beethoven needed them. Without patronage, there were no performances, no stable income. He understood this well, but he also felt another tension beginning to grow. His music did not always want to remain in the position assigned to it. It wanted to go farther, stronger, less eager to please. In private performances, he played with a focus so intense that the room seemed to disappear. At times, the sound rose higher than expected. At times, the rhythm sharpened and movements became more abrupt. The listeners remained polite, but in their eyes, surprise mixed with caution. In Vienna, even a small misalignment was enough to be remembered. Beethoven was not skilled at concealment. He did not bow naturally. He did not always say what was easy to hear. This made his relationships with patrons fragile. There were families who admired his talent, but felt uneasy about the man himself. Invitations came and went, doors opened more slowly than hoped. His life therefore remained in a constant state of uncertainty. By day, composing and practicing. By night he appeared in rooms that did not belong to him. On one side, he needed patronage to survive. On the other hand, he grew increasingly uneasy with the invisible constraints that came with it. Music gradually became a quiet dialogue. Beethoven did not rebel openly. He made no declarations. But within the works, familiar boundaries began to be pushed outward. Passages no longer existed merely to decorate a space. They demanded genuine attention. They required the listener to keep up. For some, this felt new. For others, it is inconvenient. This conflict did not erupt into a public event. It accumulated slowly, in the feeling of never fully belonging, in meals dependent on invitations, in the awareness that creative freedom and patronage rarely move together in harmony. Beethoven began to understand that if he wished to keep his own voice, he could never be entirely safe. And if he wished to be safe, he would have to trade away part of what was taking shape within him. This was his first true conflict, not with others, but with the very circumstances that sustained him. When he left the elegant rooms late at night, Beethoven stepped out into the cold street. The sound of carriages faded. The lights behind him closed. In that space, the question remained. Could an artist be nourished by order and still move beyond it? Music had not yet answered. But the tension had already begun to shape the man he would become. Chapter 9. Beethoven's Early Years of Success. There was little empty space in the rhythm of life in Vienna. The city moved even when people sat still. One meeting followed another. Invitations arrived and disappeared. If one failed to keep pace, it was easy to be left behind. The name Ludwig van Beethoven began to circulate in this way. Not loudly, not suddenly, but through repetition. In cafes where musicians and intellectuals gathered, in long evenings at salons, in conversations that ended with a brief nod. His music was remembered and then anticipated. Piano sonatas appeared with increasing frequency. They were played in different rooms, by different hands, yet they carried a distinct mark. Listeners sensed it before they could name it. This music did not simply pass through the ear, it demanded presence. It asked the listener to stay until the end. There was an unusual weight to his music, as if it sought not only to fill a room, but to test the listener's endurance. Clear openings, unexpected turns, endings that refused to hurry. People began to speak of him as something new in Vienna. Reputation took shape in a distinctly Viennese manner. Not through a grand debut, but through a sequence of appearances that proved persuasive. Beethoven gained students. His income grew more stable. Promises of the future began to form. On the surface, life took on the appearance of success. By day, Beethoven worked with relentless intensity. Manuscripts covered the table. Drafts piled up. Ink dried quickly in the warm air. He revised, crossed out, and rewrote. There was no sign of early satisfaction. Success did not slow his pace. On the contrary, it imposed a new demand. To go further. Vienna received Beethoven as a new source of energy. But like any great city, it watched closely. Comparison was a habit. The great names of the past still hovered in the air, an unspoken standard. Beethoven's music was placed beside those models, not to dismiss it, but to see how much it could withstand. It was precisely during this seemingly favorable period that a strange feeling began to emerge. Not fear, no doubt, but a light, continuous tension. Too much sound from the outside, too many eyes. Too many expectations are attached to every appearance. Crowded evenings ended late. When he returned to his room, Beethoven sat again at the keyboard in a quieter space. Their music did not need to impress. It returned closer to breath. But that breath was no longer entirely calm. Something within him was adjusting, resisting being carried away by his own success. Vienna saw a Beethoven who was confident, sharp, and sometimes unpredictable. But inside his inner world was becoming noisy in a different way. Not with sound, but with questions. Whether the attention of the world could become too strong a pull, whether music could continue to expand without losing its axis. At times, in the midst of success, he felt a kind of emptiness that was hard to name. Not lack, but excess. Too much sound from outside. Too much response. The world was speaking constantly, and he had to find a way to continue listening to himself. The early years of success, therefore, did not feel safe. They felt like a stretch of road accelerating. Everything moved forward, but demanded constant alertness. Beethoven could not yet name this sensation. He only knew that to continue living and creating in Vienna, he could not rely on inspiration alone. As night fell, oil lamps thinned along the streets. Carriage sounds drifted away. In the small room, Beethoven remained surrounded by pages of music, not yet dry with ink. Outside, success was beginning to take form. Inside, another kind of breath had just appeared, very faint, but enough to signal that the path ahead would not be made of light alone. Chapter 10. Beethoven discovers his failing hearing the first time fear is named. The letter was written very slowly, not because Beethoven lacked anything to say, but because he had never named this thing before. The lines did not try to impress. They only tried to stand upright, as if each sentence had to take responsibility for its own existence. The recipient was Franz Wegeler, an old friend from Bonn and a physician. Beethoven was not writing to the public. He was writing to someone who had known him before Vienna became the center of his life, before reputation took shape, before silence began to press in. In Vienna, Beethoven was still regarded as a rising star. He performed, he taught, he appeared in salons. His music was noticed, even debated. On the surface, everything seemed to be moving in the right direction. His name was beginning to carry expectation, not only of talent, but of presence. For Beethoven, music was no longer something done in solitude. It now unfolded before others under their gaze and judgment. But within that letter, there was a line that turned away from all of this. He wrote about no longer hearing clearly, about sounds becoming distorted, about the shame of having to lean close to another person's mouth in order to guess their words, about the exhaustion of pretending that nothing was wrong. This was not a complaint. It read more like a factual report written because silence could no longer be maintained. Beethoven was not yet in despair. He was not thinking of an end. But he was afraid, not of pain, but of being cut off from the world of music, from the society that had given him position and meaning. For a composer, the loss of hearing is not merely the loss of a sense. It is the threat of losing the right to exist. Beethoven understood this with painful clarity. And it was precisely that understanding that made the letter so difficult to write. He admitted that he had begun to avoid meetings, to avoid conversation, to avoid crowded places. Not because he disliked people, but because every exchange risked exposing what he was trying to conceal. This fear did not arrive from the darkness. It emerged in full daylight in crowded rooms where Beethoven was still expected to be witty in conversation, sharp in mind, a center of attention. The greater his success, the greater the risk of being discovered. He began to live two parallel lives, one outward where everything continued as before, and one inward where he listened to the changes in his own body with growing tension. The letter to Wegeler was not a plea for medical rescue. It was an act of acknowledgement. For the first time, Beethoven allowed fear to exist on paper. No longer a vague sensation, no longer a passing suspicion. It had shape, it had language, it had a reader. Writing it down did not make the problem disappear, but it changed his relationship to that fear. From something that had to be hidden, it became something recognized. And when a fear is named, it no longer holds complete power over the person. Beethoven continued to work. In fact, during this period, he composed with almost ferocious energy. Perhaps because he did not know how much time he still had to hear. Perhaps because work was the only way not to think about what was unfolding. Vienna still lay open before him. A city of music, of encounters, of competition and brilliance. But from this point on, Beethoven no longer entered it with the same ease. Every sound became a test. Every performance was a confrontation with a question that had no answer. The letter closed without a conclusion, no promise, no solution. Only a rare honesty sent out with the fragile hope that someone far away might understand. After the letter left his hands, Beethoven's outer life did not change at once, but inside a boundary had been drawn. From here on, he could no longer deceive himself into believing that everything was temporary. The fear had a name, and once named, it did not disappear. It simply began to walk alongside him. Beethoven did not yet know how long he would travel with that fear. He only knew that from this moment forward, every step ahead would carry something unspoken, and that unspoken presence would guide him very slowly, very quietly, toward the next great decision of his life. Chapter 11. Living among others in a world losing its sound. In conversation, Beethoven stood closer than necessary. He learned to listen with his eyes. His gaze rested on the speaker's lips. His nods came late, sometimes out of rhythm. At times he answered a question that had not yet been asked. At other moments he laughed too late after the conversation had already moved on. Not everyone noticed, and Beethoven worked to keep it that way. Concealment at first was not a strategy. It was a reflex. When something has no name yet, people often choose not to let it appear before others. Beethoven did not speak of distorted sounds. He did not mention the exhaustion that followed each conversation. He continued to appear, continued to play, continued to teach as if maintaining the outward rhythm might allow the inner world to steady itself. But social life does not run on goodwill. It runs on speed. And that speed soon exceeded Beethoven's ability to adapt. In salons, conversation shifted quickly. Laughter overlapped. Music rose and fell, giving way to talk. For Beethoven, each transition was a misstep. He had to guess, to reconnect fragments, to pretend he was in the right place at the right moment. The tension accumulated slowly. There was no clear breaking point, only evenings that ended earlier. Invitations declined more often, lengthening stretches of silence when he was alone, trying to calm the sense of failure he had just felt in the crowd. Concealment gradually became part of daily life, not to deceive others, but to protect himself. Beethoven was afraid not of what he was losing, but of what might happen if others saw it too soon. For a composer on the rise, the weakening of hearing was not a private matter alone. It was something that could be discussed, exaggerated, and eventually used to judge his worth. Beethoven understood this clearly, and that understanding turned every meeting into a test. He began to choose his spaces: smaller rooms, fewer people, one-on-one work instead of large gatherings, long hours at the writing table in place of social evenings. Music during this period remained the one place he could still control. On the page, there were no pressing gazes, no laughter arriving too early or too late, only time that belonged to him moving at a rhythm he could still hold. But even there, fatigue began to leave its mark. There were days when Beethoven returned from a meeting with his head heavy, not from speaking too much, but from having to pay attention for too long. His body reacted before his mind could explain it. Irritation arrived suddenly. Decisions were made faster, more rigidly. Among others, Beethoven began to withdraw, not disappearing entirely, but standing at the edge. No longer the center of the room, but the one who stepped outside before the conversation ended. Acquaintances might call it a difficult temperament. Beethoven knew it as the sign of a new limit. Concealment did not make fear disappear. It only delayed the moment of confrontation. And the longer it was delayed, the higher the cost became. Beethoven began to feel as if his life were slipping slightly out of alignment, as though each day required a balance that could not last. Some evenings he asked himself how long he could continue like this. Not how long he could continue composing, that he could still do. But how long could he continue appearing before others, continuing to pretend that sound still reached him as it once had? The question did not demand an immediate answer, but it was large enough to force him away from his old rhythm. Beethoven remained in Vienna, still among others. But from this point on, he no longer shared the same world of sound with them. And that difference, though unspoken, had already begun to shape the choices that lay ahead in his life. Chapter 12. Heiligenstadt, the letter never sent. Beethoven left the city not to escape, but to breathe. Heiligenstadt lay on the outskirts of Vienna, where the air was thinner, the pace of life slower, and mornings began with light rather than noise. Doctors had advised it. Go outside, stay still, avoid strain, listen to nature. He arrived with a fragile hope, one he hardly dared to name. If not for recovery, then at least for a pause in the feeling of being enclosed. In Heiligenstadt, no one demanded his presence. There were no salons, no expectant gazes, only dirt paths, garden plots, and time move evenly. But it was precisely in this seemingly gentle space that everything became clearer than ever. Sound did not return. Small experiments, careful attempts to listen again to the world around him, all led to the same result. The silence no longer wavered. It was not a phase. It was a direction, a downward slope with no detour. In Heiligenstadt, Beethoven could no longer postpone. what he had concealed in Vienna, what he had lived alongside in silence for more than a year now, demanded direct confrontation. There was no crowd to distract him, no social obligations to fill the days. Only himself and the question that had been growing over time. He wrote, not music. The words emerged like a release, not sent, not aimed at a specific reader. They resembled a whispered confession placed on paper because it could no longer be contained. Beethoven wrote to his two brothers, but he also wrote to himself. To explain, to justify, to confess. In those pages he stated plainly what had previously only been implied. He wrote of isolation, of shame. He was misunderstood as arrogant when he simply could not hear. He wrote of moments when life itself seemed impossible to continue, not because of physical pain, but because of the fear of being cut off from the human world. What matters is the way Beethoven framed the problem. He did not curse fate. He did not ask why this had happened to him. He stood instead before a choice clear, stark, and exposed. To continue living or not. Here it is necessary to slow down, because this decision did not arrive as an explosive moment. It was not a violent turn. It came through exhaustion, through depletion, through the feeling of having tried every way to avoid it and finding no way left. Beethoven admitted that he had thought about ending his life, not as a dramatic act, but as a quiet exit from a future he could no longer imagine. A composer who could not hear. A human being who could no longer share the world of sound with others. And then within those very pages, there was a pause, not because of hope for recovery, not because of comfort from outside, but because of something else, deeper, harder to say. His music was not finished. Beethoven realized that if he left now, he would take with him what had not yet been written, what had not yet been tried, what had not yet been pushed to its final limit. He did not speak of reputation. He did not speak of duty to the public. He spoke of work as something unfinished, a responsibility that could not be handed to anyone else. In Heiligenstadt, for the first time, Beethoven clearly separated personal life from creative action. He accepted that a person could be wounded to the core while the work still demanded continuation. Not because work redeems the person, but because it gives the person a reason to remain. The decision was not to live happily, it was to live on. And to live on in this case meant accepting a future entirely different from what he had once imagined. No longer a performing artist at the center of the room. No longer someone who moved easily through society, but someone who would work more in isolation, in quiet, in intense concentration. Those pages were never sent. Beethoven folded them, put them away. They were not meant to persuade anyone. They were proof to himself that a decision had been made even without witnesses. When he left Heiligenstadt and returned to Vienna, Beethoven did not return as he had been. There was no miracle, no return of sound. But something had changed forever. From this point on, he no longer lived in the hope that everything would return to how it had been. he lived with a new agreement with himself, accepting loss, accepting limitation, and from there, reorganizing his entire creative life. Heiligenstadt was not where Beethoven found answers. It was where he stopped avoiding the question. And in that stopping, another path appeared. Not easier, but possible. From this point forward, silence was no longer something to be hidden or overcome. It became a condition of life. And from that condition, a new phase began. Not loudly, not as a manifesto, just a decision held very tightly, very deep in order to continue moving forward. Chapter 13. The decision to continue living and creating. Returning to Vienna, Beethoven began to reorganize his life through very small changes. The first thing that changed was not the music, but the way he was present. He no longer tried to maintain his old role in crowded rooms. He came less often, stayed for shorter periods, and left earlier. Not out of avoidance, but because he had stopped trying to prove that he was still the same as before. Choosing not to disappear did not mean appearing more. It meant remaining in the way he still could. Beethoven began to arrange his life around limits he had accepted. Working space took priority over social space. Time given to others was weighed more carefully. Long hours of isolation were no longer signs of social failure, but the condition that allowed the work to happen. Music at this point no longer depended on immediate response. It did not require an instant audience. It did not need applause for confirmation. Beethoven worked more slowly, but more deeply. Each idea was held longer, turned over in the mind, before being placed on paper. Not because he doubted himself, but because he had stopped depending on the rhythm of the outside world. The decision made in Heiligenstadt did not turn him into a different person. It clarified the person he had always been. Someone who worked with intense focus. Someone capable of enduring isolation when creation required it. What had once been temperament now became a strategy for survival. Beethoven did not speak of this decision to anyone. He did not need witnesses, nor did he seek sympathy. What mattered had been settled internally. What remained was the daily practice of living alongside that decision. In the years that followed, Vienna continued to move at its familiar pace. Concerts, gatherings, and new trends followed one another. Beethoven did not withdraw completely, but he no longer tried to keep up. He held a distance just sufficient not to be carried away, and just close enough not to be entirely cut off. That distance was not always comfortable. There were days when he felt left behind, evenings when silence stretched longer than expected. But the crucial difference was this: he no longer confused those sensations with failure. They were simply the residue of a choice already accepted. Music began to reflect this, not directly, not as confession, but through structure, through tension and release, through longer spans, more sudden shifts, as if no longer bound by the need to please immediately. Beethoven did not write to prove that he could still hear. He wrote as if hearing were no longer a necessary condition. Isolation, once a source of fear, became a tool, not a tool for retreat, but for focus. Beethoven did not seek quiet as refuge. He used it as a working environment. The decision not to disappear was also a decision to let go of certain things. Shallow social ties, moments belonging to the crowd, quick forms of validation. In exchange came a narrower life, but a deeper one, where each day revolved around a single question: how can the work be done today? There was no sense of victory, no lasting relief. Only a new rhythm was established, fragile yet stable enough to continue. Beethoven did not look far ahead. He did not need to know where he was going, only that he would not vanish along the way. From this point forward, his creative path no longer rested on the hope of recovery. It rested on acceptance. And from that acceptance, another phase opened, quieter, less in need of witnesses, but enduring. The decision made in Heiligenstadt now began to take shape in daily life, not as a manifesto, but as a habit of staying, working, and moving forward even when the world no longer sounded as it once had. Beethoven did not disappear, and from that quiet presence his music began to enter another chapter. Chapter 14. Keeping one's own tempo in a city in motion. Vienna entered the new century with a denser rhythm than ever. The city ran on successive meetings, invitations that arrived and vanished evenings, where people gathered endlessly around music and conversation. Here opportunity rarely appeared by chance. It took shape within relationships, within rooms, whose doors were left half open, where one might be invited inside, then remembered if the impression lasted long enough. Music was inseparable from social life. It accompanied dinners, gatherings, and conversations that seemed unrelated on the surface. Pieces were heard not only for enjoyment, but to affirm the position of the performer, the listener, and even the patron. Vienna did not lack sound, but not every sound held the same place. Beethoven lived in that city, but he did not dissolve into its rhythm. He did not turn his back on Vienna. He understood clearly that to survive, there one could not stand entirely outside it. He still appeared when necessary, still brought his work into public spaces, still engaged in relationships that could not be avoided. But he also recognized early that if the city's pace were allowed to dictate his working rhythm, the work would no longer belong to him. Within a social life that ran without pause, Beethoven began to keep his labor moving at a different speed, slower, less interrupted. Not from a lack of energy, but because he required a form of concentration that could not easily survive in a chain of continuous encounters. Taste in Vienna changed quickly. New faces appeared and were spoken of. Pieces that once attracted attention could be swiftly replaced by something newer, more fashionable. Beethoven was keenly aware of this. Yet rather than adjusting himself to fit that current, he maintained the necessary distance. This distance was not a refusal, it was a deliberate choice. Beethoven's music increasingly demanded time. Not only time to write, but time to be heard properly. This made the distance between him and the public more visible. Not because the public turned away, but because the rhythms on both sides no longer aligned. Beethoven no longer wrote to meet an immediate response. He wrote as if each work belonged within a longer current, not wholly dependent on instant reaction. It was in this context that in 1809 an agreement was placed on the table. 3 patrons offered an annual stipend in exchange for a single condition that Beethoven remain in Vienna. Not that he performs more, not that he composed on commission, simply that he stay. On the surface, it was a guarantee. But for Beethoven, what he truly gained was not money. It was time. Time not to chase appointments. Time not to turn every idea into a social event. Time for the work to unfold at the private rhythm that had already taken shape. That agreement carried an unavoidable paradox. Independence is protected by a form of dependence. Creative freedom sustained through a social commitment. Beethoven understood this clearly. He did not stand outside the system, but he also did not allow the system to determine how he worked. Music continued to be written, but no longer aimed at immediate approval. It grew less predictable, less accommodating to social spaces accustomed to clarity. The distance between Beethoven and his public was therefore not closed, but maintained. Fidelio stands as a clear example of this misalignment. The work was revised many times, not from indecision, but because each return to the theater confronted Beethoven with the limits of that space. A space where music must contend with the immediate presence of crowds, expectations, and context. Recognition arrived late. It did not last, and it was not enough to alter his course. In 1814, Vienna entered a different phase, a city of celebration, the center of Europe. Light music and gatherings filled the streets more densely than usual. Beethoven's name was spoken more often as a symbol of stability amid political change. He appeared. He was welcomed. But the closeness was situational. The celebrations passed. The lights were turned off. Gatherings thinned. Vienna returned to its familiar rhythm, still in motion, still demanding constant presence. Beethoven returned as well to his own tempo. There was no sense of loss, no disappointment, only greater clarity about the position he had chosen. In a city that never stopped moving, he did not try to stand still, nor did he allow himself to be swept along. He kept his own rhythm not by withdrawing from the world, but by refusing to let the world determine entirely how he lived and worked. Chapter 15. When private life takes over. Periods of steadiness rarely last long. They create a sense of safety, and for that very reason, become fragile. Beethoven had barely returned to his familiar working rhythm when something else entered his life. Not loudly like a festival, but far more persistently. It was not music. It was family. The death of his brother Caspar Karl left a void that could not be easily filled. Not only grief, but the immediate weight of practical matters. Documents, decisions, responsibilities. And at the center of it all stood a very young boy, Carl van Beethoven. Beethoven did not step into the role of guardian out of emotion. He entered it as a duty he believed was necessary. He distrusted Karl's mother. He did not believe the boy would be raised properly without his intervention. That suspicion quickly hardened into conviction, and conviction, when brought before the law, became a dispute. What followed could not be contained within a single exchange. It stretched across years, through repeated visits to court, through affidavits, through petitions written again and again, each carrying a renewed hope, followed by deeper exhaustion. Beethoven was accustomed to revising a musical score many times. But legal documents were not like music. They did not listen. They did not soften with time. They demanded constant presence, punctuality, and strict procedure. Each departure from his room to attend court meant another interruption to his working rhythm. Vienna was no longer a city of celebration. It had returned to its administrative face. Long corridors, waiting rooms, conversations are conducted in rigid language. Beethoven, who had grown used to setting his own tempo, now had to wait his turn. He believed he was doing what was right, and it was precisely that belief that made everything heavier. For when something is regarded as morally right, it becomes very difficult to abandon, even as the cost grows clearer. Time devoted to Karl increased. Time for work narrowed not suddenly, but little by little. Karl grew up in an atmosphere of tension. Beethoven's protection came bound to high expectations, discipline, control, standards he believed were necessary to shield the boy from harmful influences. But protection, when extended too far, began to resemble pressure. Beethoven was not an easy guardian. He demanded much. He worried constantly. And he was not skilled at expressing care in gentle ways. What he could not control in his own body and in society, he tried to control within the boundaries of family life. Meanwhile, music did not disappear, but it was pushed back. The long, uninterrupted working sessions were gone. In their place came interruptions, forced pauses, ideas held for too long until they lost their original continuity. During these years, Beethoven wrote less. Not because ideas had run dry, but because private life had entered every corner. When work was no longer the sole center, it had to share space with very human concerns: health, finances, Karl's future, questions with no quick answers. The legal dispute ended on paper, but not in life. Karl remained with Beethoven, yet the stability he had hoped for did not arrive. Responsibility did not lighten with time. It only changed shape. From fighting for custody to maintaining a way of living that left both of them struggling to breathe. There were evenings when the room no longer served as a refuge. It became a place where everything piled up. Manuscripts on the table. Letters from the court are not yet put away. Unfinished words between uncle and nephew hang in the air. Not loud, but not calm. Beethoven did not see this period as a mistake. He did not regret having intervened. But he could not ignore the cost. Private life, when it takes over, does not announce itself. It quietly takes time, focus, and even the silence is needed for creation. By the end of these years, fatigue had accumulated more visibly. Not only in his body, but in how he approached work. What had once been resolved through discipline now required far more effort. Each day demanded a new adjustment, a new balance, one that was not always achieved. Yet even in this fractured period, one thing remained intact. Beethoven did not abandon his work. He was simply forced to do it under far more difficult conditions, and those conditions, though not chosen, were silently shaping what would come next. When private life had nearly taken over completely, space for music did not vanish. It contracted, became denser, harder to access, as if compressed, waiting for another moment to open. And that moment would come, not from family, not from society, but from the prolonged silence itself, which had grown too tight to endure in the old way. Chapter 16. When silence becomes a working condition. An ending rarely arrives with a clear marker. It does not knock. It simply appears slowly as certain habits vanish without leaving space behind. For Beethoven, this moment was not the day he stopped hearing, but the day he stopped waiting. For many years, the body had been treated as an unresolved question. As long as there was testing, there was hope. As long as there was an adjustment, there was a possibility. But there comes a point when every adjustment leads to the same result. No retreat, no improvement, no fluctuation large enough to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. After 1818, Beethoven no longer organized his life around the prospect of recovery. From this point on, the body became a fixed premise. This shift did not carry the tone of tragedy. It carried the tone of closure. When a door has truly closed, one no longer stands before it. One turns away, not out of relief, but because there is no longer a reason to remain. That turning brings with it a deeper reorganization, not of work, but of life itself. Beethoven stopped dividing time into phases of waiting. He no longer calculated when his hearing might improve so that he could work as before. Everything was built upon a single reality. This body would not change. In his room, Beethoven did something very simple yet decisive. He stopped asking the ear to participate. Music was no longer written as a dialogue with sound. It was written as a self-sustaining structure requiring no external confirmation. Not because he chose this path freely, but because it was the only way left to continue. This acceptance did not arrive with a sense of calm. It came with a different kind of fatigue. The fatigue of no longer having anywhere to shift responsibility. The fatigue of knowing that everything from now on had to be resolved with what remained at hand. Memory, experience, discipline, and a concentration with no exit. Once the body became fixed, every deviation grew more costly. There were no small adjustments left to correct things quickly. Each decision in the work demanded greater care because the price of revising was far higher. Music slowed down, but not from hesitation. It slowed because every step now carried weight. In this period, silence was no longer an environment. It was a biological condition. It did not change with the weather, with the mood, or with social circumstances. It was there steady like a heartbeat. And when something becomes that steady, a person either collapses under it or learns how to live alongside it. Beethoven chose the second path, not out of courage, but because there was no other way left to continue working. When everything that could change had stopped changing, life did not become lighter. It became clearer. The years that followed were built on a premise that had been settled. The outside world was no longer the rhythm to follow. What remained almost starkly was the work. His days narrowed, not through deprivation, but through refinement. Fewer meetings, less movement, fewer interruptions. The room became almost the only place where time could flow in the way he needed. No longer a place of retreat, but a place where everything could be held in its proper position. Labor during these years was uneven. There were long stretches when nothing could be written, not from exhaustion, but because everything needed more time to settle before it could take shape. Beethoven was no longer in a hurry. He stopped measuring the value of a day by the number of pages completed. A good day now could be one in which nothing written the day before had to be torn up. Manuscripts began to appear with a dense pattern of return. A passage was written, then left alone for a long time. A structure held steady for weeks before being allowed to move forward by a single step. There was no one beside him to urge him on. No deadline forcing completion. There was only one demand Beethoven placed upon himself. Nothing could be done carelessly. The isolation of these years was not social. It was methodological. Beethoven did not withdraw out of fear of people. He withdrew because this work could not endure too much noise, even when that noise existed only on paper. Each idea required its own space. And to create that space, the world had to stand farther away. Vienna continued to operate. New concerts, new fashions, new names appearing. But Beethoven no longer felt left behind. He did not compare. He did not chase. He worked within a different timeline, where value was not measured by frequent presence. There were nights that stretched longer than usual. Lamps were lit late. The writing desk was left untouched. Sheets of paper piled up carrying traces of many moments when the pen touched down and then stopped. Progress did not always come, but presence did. Beethoven was there steadily, even when results had yet to appear. The music of this period did not try to invite. It offered no easy promise. It existed as a structure that had to be entered slowly. No passage was written to impress at once. Everything seemed built on the assumption that those who approached would have to adjust their own rhythm, just as the composer had done. Beethoven's health was unstable. Days of fatigue came more frequently. At times he was forced to stop, not because ideas were lacking, but because the body would not allow continuation. But unlike earlier years, stopping no longer brought panic. It was simply part of the new rhythm. During these pauses, Beethoven did not seek compensation. He did not turn toward increased social contact. He did not look for a distraction. He allowed time to pass as part of the process. The work was not abandoned. It merely stepped back, waiting for the right conditions to resume. He no longer lived in preparation for a grand moment of performance. He lived to maintain a working state. No clear destination, no milestone to cross. Only the effort to keep the current of labor from breaking entirely. This isolation did not make Beethoven transcendent. It made him durable. Not brilliant, not easily told through moments. But within that durability, something was being prepared. Quietly, without proclamation, yet large enough that when it finally emerged, it would no longer belong only to the man who had written it. Chapter 17. When music moves beyond the individual. That evening in 1824 marked the moment when Beethoven's music entered another kind of life. A shift in the way the world received his work. After many years of being shaped under severe conditions, the music stepped forward for the first time as an independent presence, no longer requiring the physical participation of the man who had written it. The hall that night was fuller than usual, not only out of curiosity, but from a hard-to-name sense that what was about to be heard would not resemble the familiar. People came not entirely to enjoy, but to witness. The air carried a different concentration, where even small movements were noticed. The music began. And from the opening sections, it was clear that this was not something easily grasped. It did not open itself in invitation. It demanded. It required listeners to remain to adjust their own internal tempo. Some could not. But the silence in the hall revealed that something essential had happened. This music did not pass by unnoticed. Beethoven was present, but he was no longer the center of the experience. He did not control. He did not guide. He did not confirm. His presence at this point was symbolic rather than functional. The work had traveled far enough that it no longer required final intervention from its creator. When the final section closed, the reaction arrived like an uneven wave. There was excitement. There was confusion. There were hesitations before people rose to their feet. Yet it was precisely this unevenness that showed the music had crossed beyond the boundary of easy agreement. It did not need everyone to understand. It only needed to be impossible to ignore. From that moment on, something shifted quietly. This music was no longer spoken of as the work of an individual living within a city. It began to be referenced as a point of measure, something others would have to reckon with when considering what could be written next. Beethoven did not directly witness this transition, not because he was absent, but because it did not take place in the concert hall. It unfolded in the conversations that followed, in repeated mentions, in the way this music was used to weigh other works. From here on, his role had moved to a different position. After that evening, Beethoven's life did not change much. He still returned to the familiar room, still kept his slow working rhythm. There was no feeling of having reached a summit, only a subtle shift difficult to see from this point on his music. no longer required his presence in order to exist. This did not bring immediate release, but it created a new distance, a distance between the writer and the work, a necessary distance allowing the work not to be pulled back into personal life. The music had crossed to the other side where it was held more by collective memory than by the hand that had written it. For Beethoven, this was not an ending. He did not stop. But from this moment forward, each completed work carried a different understanding. It would soon no longer belong to him. And that understanding altered the way he continued to work in the years that remained. The music had begun to live its own life. It no longer needed protection, no longer needed explanation, no longer needed to be heard by the one who had written it. And when that happened, Beethoven's role shifted as well. He was no longer the one standing at the center, but the one who had stepped back far enough for the work to stand on its own in the world. Chapter 18. After Silence Remains. Death came to Beethoven as a natural closing of a process that had been unfolding for a very long time. His final days did not carry the shape of a carefully staged ending, but rather the feeling of exhaustion that had accumulated enough for the body to stop. He lay in the familiar room where every object remained in its place, where life had long been organized around the steady rhythms of work and rest. Those at his side heard very few words. In his final years, Beethoven had grown accustomed to a life of labor and quiet presence. What needed to be expressed had already found other forms. Through the work itself, through repeated choices, through the simple fact of continuing to sit at the writing desk, even as conditions grew increasingly severe. When Beethoven died, the news spread quickly. His name was spoken in many places at once. This was not only the passing of a man, but the sudden absence of something that had existed long enough to become part of shared life. Vienna seemed to slow for a moment, as if needing time to register the space that had just opened. The funeral was larger than many had expected. Alongside musicians and those who had known him personally were people who had lived with his music in private evenings, in moments not attached to any particular face. They came to mark the end of a presence that had become familiar even when it was not always consciously named. The remaining manuscripts lay on the table exactly as they had for many years. They reflected a way of working that did not place completion above everything else. Some pages were clear, some unfinished. Some ideas stopped midway. Taken together, the mass of paper showed a process always in motion, not confined by the idea of a perfect ending. After Beethoven was gone, his music entered another life. It was played again, read again, understood again, at different tempos in spaces far removed from the room where it had once been written. That music began to live within collective memory, separated from the personal conditions that had once surrounded it. Debates continued to arise as a natural part of that process. Some works were embraced quickly. Others required a longer span of time to be understood. Beethoven's music allowed for this. It was solid enough to withstand multiple interpretations and open enough to keep entering new currents of time. The absence of the composer also created a new condition. With Beethoven no longer present to explain or adjust the work, could stand more fully on its own. The music could be confronted directly without detouring through biography or personal circumstance. That distance allowed the works to find their place within a wider space where they could be heard as themselves. Looking back across the entire journey, what stands out is not loss, but steadiness. Not how silence was endured, but how life was organized so that work could continue within it. Silence did not extinguish the music. It forced the music to find another form of existence, one more fitting to the reality that had taken shape. Beethoven left behind no clear statement about the meaning of his life. He did not need to. What remains is enough for others to continue asking questions. Not about genius, but about the capacity to work over long periods under conditions not freely chosen. When the final room was opened, the feeling was not of a complete ending, but of a continuation long prepared. The music continued its movement into the world, along paths no longer tied to a single human life. And history from that point on took over its share of the work. Years later, Beethoven is still remembered not only for his music, but for the way that music was made. A life that gradually narrowed, yet the work did not stop. A body that lost the ability to hear, yet the rhythm of labor remained steady. Beethoven's legacy does not lie in the number of works, nor only in their scale. It lies in the ability to organize a life around work, even as favorable conditions slowly fell away. He did not try to overcome silence. He lived with it and then built a form of existence within it. From this, the world's understanding of creativity also shifted. Creation was no longer bound tightly to perfect bodies or ideal circumstances. It appeared instead as a durable act capable of continuing under limited conditions if life was organized with sufficient care. In today's world, where sound is abundant and attention is scattered, that story carries a different meaning. Not to glorify endurance, but to remind us that profound work is often shaped by patiently living alongside limits rather than waiting for those limits to disappear. Beethoven left no formula. He left a way of seeing. There are moments in life when what matters is not restoring what has been lost, but choosing what to do with what remains. And from that foundation, something can continue to be written quietly, yet with the strength to endure for a very long time. And so this journey gradually comes to a close. From a small room in Bonn where music began as a strict discipline to the years in Vienna that first opened wide and then slowly narrowed from crowded concert halls to days of work in silence. A human life has passed not through sudden leaps, but through slow, steady movements almost unnoticed. We have moved through a childhood cut short, through the early years of recognition, through the moment when fear was finally named, and through the long stretch of time, when silence ceased to be an event and became a condition of living. At the end of that road, Beethoven does not stand before a crowd. He does not wait for recognition. He remains in the familiar room at the writing desk, among pages marked by countless returns, revisions, and abandoned starts. There is no grand closing gesture. Only a rhythm of life is organized firmly enough to continue until it stops. By this point, the music has left him. It moves into the world along its own paths, sounding in spaces where he is no longer present, heard by people who never knew the room in which it was written. And it is there that Beethoven remains in history. Not as a legend to be admired, but as a trace of sustained work carried out under conditions not chosen with a steadiness that does not need to be named. So why does he still matter tonight? Perhaps not because of the great symphonies themselves, but because he shows another human capacity, the ability to organize a life around what one believes is necessary, even as the outside world gradually withdraws. On evenings like this, when sound is already abundant, when attention is scattered, this story lingers as a very gentle reminder that not all meaningful work needs to unfold in bright light. Some things are built slowly in silence and still have the strength to remain for a very long time. If stories like this help you relax a little, help the day close more softly, you can subscribe to the channel or leave a comment. It is a quiet way for us to know that you are still listening. Now, as the light has softened, as this story can stay with you in its own way, let everything settle. Drift into sleep